Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where we discuss international affairs. I'm Martin Zubko. Today we'll be exploring Germany's approach to emerging powers, its foreign policy, and some of its latest geopolitical moves. My expert today is Tomasz Morozowski. Hello.
Hello, thank you very much for having me here.
Tomasz Morozowski is an analyst at the Institute for Western Affairs in Poznań, which is Poland's leading institute for research and analysis specializing in German studies. He is the author of various Polish and international publications, and his research focuses on international relations, foreign policy of Germany and the European Union, Europe-China relations, emerging powers, and much more. His latest book, German Foreign Policy Towards Emerging Powers, Co-Shaping Globalization, examines the complex process of German foreign policy, its adaptation to shifting global landscape, and especially when it comes to emerging powers. It's grounded within the theoretical framework of Neoclassical Realism. The book then analyzes the inner workings of Germany's global policy formation. And this is very interesting because usually when we have Germany, we have topics like Germany and China, Germany, United States, Germany, European Union. But emerging powers, that's something different. And I'm very happy that Tomasz accepted the invitation to talk about this topic based on his book. So let's start with the first question. What new frameworks or methodologies are required to understand Germany's policy towards emerging powers?
Yes, thank you very much again. And I also think it's important today to talk about this global perspective on foreign policy in general, but especially on German foreign policy, which is mainly analyzed in the context of EU, like you said, and transatlantic relations. I think this global dimension is kind of maybe not neglected, but a little bit, left on the side. So that was really that's kind of the reason for my focus on this topic in my research. And of course, globalization, we all know this process, how it influences international relations as they are and as they were. But I think the process generally of globalization not only changes the conditions for states, how they conduct foreign policy, but it is also a very big challenge for us, for researchers, because it completely changes or creates this need for us to change the perspective. There are several factors that constitute this challenge, and I would name three. One of them is, of course, the denationalization of foreign policy. We all know that the very traditional way of thinking about international relations, especially in the realist school of thought, treats the state as a central actor, right? Of course, the state-centric theories. Definitely, after the years, we had the neorealist school of thought, where kind of this level of analysis has been moved to the systemic level a little bit, but still the central role of the state is kind of starting point for the analysis of international relations. And with globalization, we kind of experience this blurring of what's foreign policy, what's domestic policy. Maybe we could also say that we have this crisis of authority of national states, and we have this transformation generally from the national to post-national constellation, with all the non-state actors of international relations, such as international organizations, NGOs, business lobbies, but also media, terrorist groups. We can all see how these actors take part today very actively in international relations. So this is kind of the second factor, the proliferation of actors, where we have this notion of even a disaggregated state, which means that the state is not anymore a concise, specific actor, but it's kind of disaggregated, divided into institutions, government bodies, political parties, organizations, and so on. When we talk about Germany, we sometimes say that Germany is not a state that owns companies, but the German companies own the state. This kind of gives us this perspective on a state, a national state whose foreign policy is influenced to a high degree by other actors. And third challenge, or third factor for this challenge posed by globalization to foreign policy analysis, I would name, is the new interpretation of the notion of power, of the power of the state, basically. And this kind of this issue is also very relevant to Germany, which of course we all know is a state that doesn't really base its potential in international relations on hard power. We have this identity of civilian power, like Hans Maul described it in Germany, for Germany, but it bases its potential on economic power and soft power. I think this new perspective on what is the power of a state, and that it can be exercised at a distance also, thanks to the development of technologies, but is also dispersed among other actors. Again, not only state can exercise power today. This all lead us to the conclusion that in foreign policy analysis we also need new perspectives, new methodologies. But just one small comment here, that of course we have to be aware that the modern contemporary nature of the events in the world and the reality of international relations a little bit puts us back to the notion of power of states. We have a little bit the resurgence of power politics, of nationalist politics by several states, to name China or Russia, of course. We have states and organizations looking inwards. Also in the field of economy, we have this return of protectionism. Also, on the side of the EU and US, or even tendencies to autarky. So we kind of are moving back, and we have to be also mindful of this. But I think globalization in general has brought big challenges and big differences to the nature and to the research of the international relations.
Tomasz, when researching Germany, there is always an issue of European Union. And some student might ask, when you researching Germany's foreign policy, and then you have the European Union sort of foreign policy, did you face any significant challenges? Because that might go to sort of complexity, which might be quite interesting to research. So how was the impact of the European Union when you were researching Germany?
So, of course, the primary level, the foundation level for German foreign policy or layer is the EU, the European context. I have focused my research on the global dimension of Germany's foreign policy, which, of course, cannot be separated from the European level, right? So, in some points, in some cases, Germany is pursuing its global policy goals through the EU level. But what's interesting, maybe even more, is that there are a lot of issues and a lot of policies which Germany actually conducts without this inclusion of this European level. So basically, on a bilateral basis with those new global partners, be it India, China, Brazil, South Africa, or many, many more, or by engaging into regional integration, regional organizations in those regions with those countries. So I would say there is no contradiction here. So it's not like Germany pursuing its own policy in the philosophy of doing it alone. This famous Alleingang in German, how it was called. But what's definitely a visible tendency for Germany is not to limit itself only to support European policies when we talk about global issues. Germany, one of primary goals for Germany is to play a significant role in global governance, in international organizations like the UN and G20 and so on, and to be active in including new emerging powers also into these processes.
Right. One of the things that caught my attention when I was reading the book was that you use Neoclassical realism. So let's speak a little bit about this. Why this stream of the theory of international relations? That's the first point. And the second point, how can neoclassical realism be used to analyze Germany's foreign policy decisions? And also, Tomasz, if you can say, let's say, one or two sentences, what does neoclassical realism mean for you?
Yes, this brings us a little back to the first question, right? About how to analyze foreign policy of states today. So let's focus on Germany as the example, in the context of very dynamic global transformations and, the shifts of power from the old, let's say, old powers like the US and the West, generally speaking, more towards Asia and global South also, in a very general way, to use this term. And here, neoclassical realism comes in as a modern variant of course, this traditional realist school of thought on international relations, starting with, of course, Morgenthau and this traditional realism, then Waltz and neorealism, where I think the neoclassical realism is this variant that is best suited to this very dynamic modern world, let's say. But it's what it allows, and what is compelling for me as a researcher, and is the reason also why I decided to use this theoretical approach, is that it allows to analyze variables from the level of the system, so the global environment, and the level of the actors, so the level of state. So we have this framework of thinking in neoclassical realism, where we start with the independent variable, which is the systemic variable. In the case of Germany, it would be the global power shifts and the emergence of new powers. So the international, environment, that's the independent variable. And then at the end, we have the dependent variable, which is, of course, the outcome, the foreign policy of a state, how it conducts its foreign policy in the real world by the diplomats, by political parties, economic actors, and so on. But what happens in between is this so-called black box of state. So this is the state level, which I mentioned that this approach also allows us to delve into, where we can analyze several intervening variables, picking, be it political organizations, be it business lobby, society preferences, and so on. So how does this process function within a state of conceptualizing and creating some strategies of foreign policy? In the case of Germany, I have focused on strategic documents by German government starting in the 90s, then especially since the beginning of the 21st century, how political parties, but also researchers, think tanks, so this kind of epistemic communities, we could call them, create this whole landscape of debates on foreign policy of Germany, how they perceive the risks and the opportunities coming out from the global power shifts and globalization, and which recommendations do they formulate in strategies. And then going to the dependent variable, I was able to analyze the outcomes, and most importantly, did the outcomes and the effects actually match the expectations, and did they fulfill the recommendations for Germany in realizing its policy towards emerging powers, which I looked at in two fields, economic field and order shaping field, which is, let's call it generally political field, right? So did Germany actually get something out of those relations in terms of economic benefits, trade, investment, new markets, and so on? And on the other hand, was Germany able to kind of include those new global partners in this network of like-minded states that would enable Germany to strengthen its policy in, be it global climate policy, security policy, human rights, democracy, all those main values that still are kind of directing German policy in the vein of civilian power, right? So I think in this case, neoclassical realism was really a useful tool, a theoretical approach. Although one more maybe comment here, I was also aware of the fact that the liberal school of thinking would be kind of maybe a default one for many researchers to analyze Germany as the civilian power, directed in multilateralism, not actually basing its power, like I mentioned before, on hard power and military, military aspects. But here I would say that neoclassical realism is kind of bridging those two separate schools of thought, liberal and realist, and enables us to include those variables on the level of the actor again. So I'm coming back here, which allows us to analyze how the state extracts and deploys its potential, not only in the field of hard power, military power, and so on. So here the economic aspect, soft power, this German, made in Germany brand and so on, is kind of creating this potential for Germany in international relations.
Thomas, and have you come across any limitations or shortcomings of the neoclassical realism while conducting the research?
So we have to remember it's still a realist school of thinking, which centers our attention on the state as the actor in international relations. And the other issue I would say we have to be careful with neoclassical realism is not to include too many intervening variables. So just to focus on several of them. In my case, I focused on three, which were political parties, governing and opposition since the 90s in Germany, then business organizations like German Chamber of Commerce abroad, the Federation of German Industries, and so on. They are actually very important actors in this process of shaping German foreign policy. And the third one, the third intervening variable is the whole epistemic communities field. So universities, think tanks, researchers, experts, they actually take an active part in creating also strategies for German policy in the global field. So this warning, or let's say a point where we would have to be careful, is not to include too many intervening variables, because that would make our analysis too detailed, I would say. And what we still need to focus on is that neoclassical realism would like to explain, or aims to explain, the outcomes of foreign policy of a state.
In the book, there are two concepts that I come across, and that's the continuity versus adaptation in foreign policy. So let's apply this to Germany's foreign policy. So what factors have driven this shift, especially in the context of emerging powers? And when we come to Germany, how has Germany's foreign policy evolved from maintaining continuity to adopting more adaptive stance, which is adaptation?
Yeah. Yes, two very important notions that German foreign policy is kind of bumping from while evolving throughout the years. Of course, since the reunification, we had this main driver or main orientation of the Western integration, European integration, getting involved in the common market and so on, all under the security umbrella of the United States. And then how it evolved was, of course, the inclusion into the global network of trade relations. Then we had this German model of economic development, which of course was very effective throughout the years and placed Germany, in the position of the third largest global economy in terms of GDP last year, overtaking Japan. So actually Germany, could benefit a lot from this model, but it also brought several risks, like of course economic dependencies on Russia and China, which in case of Russia became quite a challenge, right now for Germany. But what I want to say is that this kind of adaptation has taken place throughout the years since German reunification. Adaptation meaning reacting to what's going on in the world, to how markets are being opened up, which possibilities it brings to German business and German industry. But then on the other hand, we have this issue of continuity, which still dates back to the 1950s, where German foreign minister Klaus Kinkel was talking about continuity 3 times, right? Continuity, which meant actually that German foreign policy should maintain those fundamental guidelines and slogans such as predictability, reluctance, responsibility, focusing on multilateralism and inclusion of all the partners, working with consensus and so on and so on. So actually avoiding this politics of power, Machtpolitik, as it's described in Germany, and of course Europeanization of foreign policy. So this was kind of still this this tendency visible until today in German, also global policy. But I would say that's what I have focused on. So this broadening, let's say, of the horizon of German policy with this global perspective, and including strategies towards Asia and China, especially focusing on China in the first place, then including other partners in Asia, then looking also to Africa and South America for new partners, is kind of the next level or the next stage of the process of adapting of the German foreign policy to new conditions. But what's another driver of this is also the expectations from Germany's partners, because we hear a lot, from other European states that Germany should take bigger responsibility as the biggest, European economy, should play a more decisive role, and should be the driving power of the EU as well, which of course not everybody expects today. This has changed as well due to crisis in Germany today, political and economic destabilization. But still, these expectations throughout the years have also pushed Germany kind of to play a more active role, to try to engage with new actors. So I think what's important is that that in Germany I could notice this perception of changes in the environment, of this transformation of global architecture, which in the documents I have analyzed have been described as watershed phase of the world, or that the world has been shaken into foundations, that the construction of international order is under a fundamental change. And from this perception, the recommendations or suggestions for German political elites has been to adapt, to react, to be more active, and to create strategies towards new emerging powers. So this is kind of the starting point for my research as well, where I then focus on next consecutive strategic documents, coalition agreements, and so on, and I analyze how this worked in practice. So to finalize this, I would say that that the factor of change in the international architecture has driven Germany to try to strategically adapt. Of course, we still didn't get to how it actually worked, right, in practice. So to effectiveness of this. But when the conditions of the German model of development, which has been very successful with the international rules-based international order, free trade with WTO at the center, when all this has kind of destabilized, this creates the necessity for Germany to kind of rethink its approach, and maybe its policy towards new global partners or emerging powers is one of the solutions here.
How does Germany identify and classify emerging powers in its foreign policy? Because we're speaking about emerging powers, but we still haven't named any countries.
Yes, that's right. And that's important also because this classification or a kind of semantics concerning emerging powers is very important, but it's also not that complicated if you just look into those strategic documents, because it goes logically with the development of the English literature terminology, starting with emerging powers or markets still in the 1980s and the 90s, as the new point of interest for financial organizations in the US, creating those indexes of new emerging markets which are attractive for an investment. Asian tigers and all those states. Of course, China and Asia played a significant primary role there, but then throughout the years, we of course had the BRICS, the BRIC and then BRICS format created, and also actually created by analysts, and then transformed into a real format of international cooperation of those states. So next countries, Russia, but also India, China, and Brazil, as the main emerging powers. I would say that BRICS group is kind of the default group of states that we think of when we say emerging powers, still until today. Although throughout the years, we could argue if China is still an emerging power, right, or Brazil or India, or on the other hand, has this process of emerging, of rising already finished, right? I think that's the reason why then in the terminology we had new groups, new definitions like BRICS Plus, BRICSAM, Next 11, many terminologies of which kind of, I don't want to get into detail which countries were included, but the main idea was to broaden the definition of emerging powers and to include new countries, new states, be it, Mexico, Nigeria, Egypt, Thailand, and so on, South Korea, Indonesia. We have many of them. And in the German literature and then strategic documents, this evolution of how to understand and classify emerging powers was kind of following this path. So it started with Asian strategies directed towards Asia, where China played a main role. Then we had Africa strategies, South America strategies. These states have been generally called Aufstrebende Mächte, which is the German term for emerging powers. But there were also very interesting documents and concepts which I cannot really detail for you here, but I would just mention some terms used there. After translating into English, it was anchor states, pivotal states, regional powers, or leading powers. And in each of these texts, those states were characterized differently. Okay, so different roles were prescribed for them as for partners, from German point of view. And these roles diverged from being potential partners to potential blockers, or like-minded partners, countries posing a challenge for Germany, or even troublemakers, Herausforderer and Störer in German, right? So Germany, or in the strategic, let's say, in the strategic analysis in Germany, those states were perceived in a very, various roles. And what Germany and German policy, but also makers, but also experts and academics were trying to do is to create an umbrella strategy, like a big strategic, framework of how Germany should approach all those new global partners, emerging powers, we call them in the most general ways. So that's very interesting, and maybe we will still get into more detail, further in our conversation. But what's just one more point I would like to make when we classify states as emerging powers, or all the anchor states, pivotal states, and so on, is the factors that we take into consideration, because these can be economic factors like the size of GDP, integration into world trade, imports, exports, and so on. This was kind of the root factor when the Western institutions defined emerging powers. But then what's important, so not only the geographical perspective has broadened, but also the thematical perspective has broadened. And this also applies to Germany. So from economic factors, it also was enriched kind of by other factors, for example, regional influence, a capacity to enter into alliances, and also will of those states to enter into alliances and to influence the multilateral and international cooperations. Of course, military potential, demographic potential, very important when we talk about India, for example, and soft power. So all these things, so kind of potential and willingness of those states to actively engage into international cooperation were also conditions for Germany to include them in this catalog of new global partners or emerging powers.
What Germany is learning, what sort of lessons can Germany draw from some case studies? And let's start firstly, as you mentioned, with the BRICS group, and let's put Brazil, India, South Africa, and I leave it up to you. What can you say about these three countries and Germany's foreign policy? And maybe you can pick few main ideas, main things that you come across.
Well, of course, the first question doesn't concern China.
Yes.
From you, which is also maybe a nice change to the main focus of all the news and all the analysis we have today, which center on China for obvious reasons, right? Being the most important challenge, let's say, for the Western world today. But for sure, China will come up anyway, and it's interesting that we start with Brazil, India, and South Africa. Just also one more comment. I left out Russia from my analysis because it's part of BRICS as well, so we have to mention Russia. but Russia doesn't really fit into this definition of an emerging power as we understand it in the case of global South, let's say, and India, Brazil, and South Africa and other states, because of Russia's history, Russia's characteristic of internal political model, and so on and so on. So I think that's quite obvious, but also important to mention. So getting to the IPSA states, so India, Brazil, and South Africa, they actually constitute this IPSA format of cooperation. It's interesting because these three states actually, which is one of the conclusions of my research, play the role of the model partners, let's say, or of the partners towards which the German expectations were fulfilled and in the most, right, to the highest degree. And they are important trading partners for Germany, ranking in 30th position among all global partners. India being the most important from those three. They create this group of strategic partners for Germany. So Germany actually established this strategic partnership with South Africa as the first state in history. So in 1996, this strategic partnership has been established, which means basically that the relations between Germany and those states are kind of lifted to the new level. And it means that Germany has a very comprehensive policy towards those states, would like to develop relations not only in economic field, but also in people-to-people exchanges, labor mobility, very important for German workforce is now the mobility from India of IT and medical specialists. So these things, cultural exchanges, so all the very, very broad relations. That's the strategic partnership. And in the case of India, Brazil, and South Africa, these strategic partnerships are very well institutionalized. There are many formats in which Germany engages with them. And what's interesting, not only on the bilateral level, but also with all of them together. So Germany actually also initiated what's called a quadrilogue. So a level of political dialogues with all three countries, which constitute actually the GIPSA, right? So Germany, India, Brazil, South Africa. So that's kind of interesting. And I did not actually encounter this kind of engagement on this level by Germany towards other states. And of course, this does not mean that these states and relations with those states are free from problems and from challenges, right? So we still have differing views from India and Brazil when it comes to trade issues. We now can see how difficult it is to finalize, trade agreements between EU and Mercosur, but also with India. And here I would also point to the German position, because Chancellor Scholz has many times expressed his disappointment with the European attitude, that it goes too slow with the finalization of trade agreements. So here Germany would really like to make it faster, to kind of lower the barriers, so that German companies and European companies would be able to invest even more in those countries. So that's really important. I mentioned this because it's important. It's crucial, to remember that there is no perfect partner for Germany. None of them is fulfilling all the expectations. But of course, partnerships with India, Brazil, and South Africa, for example, are much easier for Germany to develop than, for example, with China, which of course is a big challenger for also the worldview, right, and the view of multilateral cooperation and so on, compared with the West and Germany. So these three states, the IPSA states, constitute those like-minded partners, right, where Germany can really say they take part in promoting multilateralism together, and they engage, they to more or less, but they also follow this the values like human rights, democracy, and so on, which still are the kind of very important points for Germany in its foreign policy. So those three states would be kind of the model partners when we analyze the global strategy of Germany.
The next one, I wouldn't go for countries, but the region, and that's Indo-Pacific. And we know how European Union is really pushing some policies, some frameworks to have some footprint in the Indo-Pacific. So if it's successful or if it's less successful, this will judge the time. But what can we say about Germany and Indo-Pacific? What sort of emerging powers have you identified in the Indo-Pacific that you should mention as important ones?
That's a crucial concept of Indo-Pacific, and actually we could trace in the last decade that states, starting with the US, then European states, started to formulate their own national strategies towards Indo-Pacific as a region. And then Germany followed suit as well in 2020, when the German government created this document framework for Indo-Pacific for policy of Germany. And of course, it's directed towards some states defined as emerging powers. It's of course defined as an open strategy for each partner that would share, the values and the interests of Germany, free to join, and Germany is open for cooperation with all of them. But definitely, we could, from the political practice and experience, we could point to some most important ones, which would definitely be India, Indonesia, ASEAN states as a group, Australia, Japan, South Korea. So those allies for Germany and for the West as well. But what's the common, let's say, common feature of them is that they oppose or feel threatened or are afraid of expansive policy of China, of course. And the Indo-Pacific strategy from Germany does not exclude China or is not oriented against China. That's something that we wouldn't expect from a German strategic document. But in some points, like let's say protecting the freedom of navigation in the seas, and upholding the United Nations laws of the seas, and also protecting the infrastructure, and also developing new technologies, be it AI or all the other technologies with some standards. That all all these things point to this strategy actually being oriented towards China and being a reaction by Germany to Chinese influence in the region as well, and kind of seeking for like-minded partners here. Of course, one feature of the strategy, it's already almost 5 years old, so we can already judge a little bit its effectiveness. And what I can notice is that it actually brought this effect of Germany engaging much more in the military, level, actually sending warships, sending frigates, sending also planes and so on to take part in common exercises. And we had this Indo-Pacific deployment exercise, for example, this year together of the armies and maritime forces by India and Germany and other partners. We had also exercises with Australia, Philippines, and so on, where German forces were actually involved, German Navy and Air Forces, for the first time, I would say, right, since the reunification, in this scale for sure. And we had the reaction from China when Chinese authorities did not allow one of the frigates, German frigates, to kind of visit the Chinese port. So this is something that's interesting for me, because it's not typical for Germany, of course, to develop this military engagement. Of course, it doesn't mean that Germany gets involved in any armed conflict, but in case it actually becomes reality, for example, when the tensions around Taiwan Strait, get to the next level, this could happen very quickly, and having in mind new administration in Washington, new president, and all this tension in U.S.-Chinese relations, this could really become a reality for Germany to have to respond to some expectations, for example, from the U.S. And in the philosophy of we helped Europe towards Russia, so now we need Europe to help us towards China. That would, I think, bring Germany in quite a difficult situation, which already is very difficult when we take into account, economic ties and dependencies on Chinese market in Germany. So this is a very interesting new dynamic here. But it's one of the consequences of this Indo-Pacific strategy. And maybe one more comment here would be that because you asked also which lessons or conclusions would Germany draw from all those relations with emerging powers. So in the case of Indo-Pacific strategy, this is one evidence that actually this idea of creating one general framework for all the global partners did not really become the most effective one, right? So Germany started in the 90s and beginning of 21st century with regional strategies, or even state concerning one state. Then it moved in 2012 towards this big umbrella strategy of what is called Shaping Powers Program, Gestaltungsmächte in German, which is kind of also the idea for the subtitle of my book, right? Co-shaping globalization. So he had this idea that we could have this framework for all the shaping powers. And now we could see this, again, the circle closing, and Germany in the recent years creating Indo-Pacific strategy, so a regional one, China strategy, last year, so very oriented towards one state. This year we had India strategy, so we kind of can see that I think the German authorities realized that it's not possible to create one universal framework, that you have to treat those states specifically and to kind of create policy that is fitted to the needs and challenges of each relation on the bilateral basis or regional.
We mentioned South Africa as a part of the African continent, but Tomasz, what about the other states in Africa? Have you identified any emerging powers that Germany is interested in and that Germany is trying to develop either bilateral or multilateral relations with them on the scale that it's visible that interest is really pushing in Africa?
Here, when we analyze the African vector, let's say, of German global policy, it's characterized by some problems not visible on other vectors, and main one is that Africa is a little bit still treated like a continent by itself, and Germany lacks really nuanced strategies towards states. In the strategic reflection and documents, I could identify that Germany actually focuses on South Africa and Nigeria. So these two states as separate states where there was some kind of approach to make a more specific strategy towards them. Of course, I think we could say two most important, biggest or most influential states in Africa. So that's kind of or sub-Saharan Africa. So that's kind of justified, but it's still the consequence of this is still that on the side of other African states, there is this feeling of unfulfilled promises or expectations, or still being treated as a group. This is also the case, with the other European states with still some colonial, legacy to it in case of France and other states, but also the EU strategies, which always promise that now we will have this partnership of equal partners, that we will actually invest in Africa and treat those countries as equal partners and not as some states that need support and need development aid. This is a little bit also the case for Germany, but one let's say direction is that Germany also tries to engage here on the level of other global international organizations such as G20. So we had this compact Africa, G20 compact with Africa, initiated by Germany. We have also this framework of Global Gateway, the infrastructure program of the EU, and Germany is very intensively supporting such initiatives and involving in cooperation here. But on the bilateral level or on this level of German national policy here, I would say it's still treated as a group of states, as a region. Of course, we have bilateral visits by foreign minister, by the chancellor in several states in Africa each year. And now we have this new let's say, issue of green transition, green technologies, renewables, where we have for the solar and wind energy great conditions in African states. So this is a new priority for Germany. Also the green hydrogen, where we can see new initiatives and offers by Germany. But I would say this still comes from the justification for it is still German interest, right? So Germany need to change its energy supply chains, and that's why African states maybe would now become more important partners for Germany. Yes, we will see how this develops. Of course, the idea would be that both sides kind of benefit. Germany is always also maybe it's not a nice word, promotes this policy as a win-win situation, creating jobs and rising the standards of living in Africa. But then comes reality, and we will see if this will really bring a quality change to the engagement of EU and Germany in Africa.
We mentioned some countries and some regions, and there is one question from students. Was there any country, while you were researching Germany's foreign policy towards emerging powers, that surprised you a lot in terms of research, maybe expectations that you had before?
Yeah, two countries, Mexico and Vietnam. These are actually the two states from the group that I have chosen for analysis, which of course was limited and basing on case study analysis. But from this catalog of 10 states, Vietnam and Mexico were two that evidence the most dynamic growth of importance when it comes to economic relations, so trade, imports and exports, investment for German companies, opening up for those investments, creating programs, supporting German investment, especially of the small and medium enterprises, so Mittelstand. So these two partners really proved that the German strategy was efficient, right, and brought some effects. Because with others, let's say the older emerging powers like the BRICS states, it was a little bit it was harder to point that the German strategic focus actually caused the development of relations, because it happened earlier, right? So relations with China, exploded already in the first decade of 21st century. And the German strategic focus intensified in the 2010, 12 and onwards, right? So in the case of the traditional emerging powers, let's call them like this was hard to provide this evidence that strategies worked. Maybe they only strengthened the cooperation. But in the case of Vietnam and Mexico, it was visible. And of course, still not in the same way, because Vietnam is still not a perfect like-minded partner for Germany when it comes to understanding of values of democracy, of cooperation and so on, because of the nature of this state and its system and so on. But in the case of Mexico, it really also became an important partner in the economic field, but also in the order shaping field when it comes to cooperation in global climate policy, trade regulations, and all the other fields. So here we would really point those two states as surprising and most positive examples.
One technical question. You mentioned that you were going through strategic and other documents in terms of research. How difficult was it to find those documents? That's the first question. And for those who don't speak German, would it be possible to do it without knowing German language?
Well, it was not difficult, because Germans are really, let's say, precise and put a lot of attention to creating strategies. So there is this joke that they really write a lot of documents, and then it's hard to see the reason why. But really, like when it comes to sources, they're really available. When a ministry creates a let's say Africa strategy by the development ministry for economic development, then it's just easy to find on its website. It's also the case that it has been described in the literature when it comes to some specific fields. So let's say when there is, a literature on German relations with African continent or with China, then you can really find a lot of mentions there of those documents and kind of support your analysis with this, what other authors have found in those documents. So there were really just several cases where I was not able to find a document on a website of a ministry or office of the chancellor or in some archives that has been mentioned in the literature but was not visible on the websites. Even the outdated ones are still there. But the other very important source for my research was the analysis of debates in the German Bundestag, which is also very well archived and very well, you can find all the stenograms of those discussions, very detailed, where you can even find out when somebody laughed and all the comments. So it's really a proof that Germans have this feature of being very precise. But here you need the knowledge of German language because whereas the strategic documents usually come in two language versions, also not always, but usually in German and English, then in the case of German, Bundestag debates, the stenograms and the transcripts are in German. So I would say that would be necessary to know German language here.
Great. Tomasz, let's wrap up our discussion, our dialogue, and I have two last questions for you. The first one, let's speak about the long-term strategic goals. So what are the Germany's long-term foreign policy goals concerning emerging powers?
So they are actually constant, and this is always the protection of rules-based international order. This is always protection of free trade, of multilateral cooperation. So this kind of civilizing international relations, and kind of strengthening the open multilateral cooperation to the benefit of all. But these are slogans, and as long as they still remain the driving, let's say, identities and driving ideas for German foreign policy, also towards global South and this broad group of states. The underlying and maybe more real strategic goal for Germany is, of course, its national interest. So this is where the realist school of thinking comes back and justifies this analysis, because of course Germany wants to still develop its economy, its standard of living, and so on. And what's important is this how influential the business lobby, the big corporations, be it in the automotive sector, chemical, and all the other industrial sectors, traditional sectors in Germany. And those big corporations really have a big influence, not only on top politicians, but also in this field, in this process of creating strategic documents, in Germany. So there are a lot of conferences, debates, articles by members of those organizations and companies. So this makes the German foreign policy actually the foreign economic policy, and this brings one of the tensions between interests and values, of course, but this is kind of still, and it hasn't changed since the 90s. So these are still the two most important veins or trails in German foreign policy, where we can identify main goals. But of course, in the narrative level, when you listen to what chancellor or foreign minister or other politicians say, they always mention those ideological goals primarily, and then the economic gains should follow. When you analyze it in detail, it's actually the other way around. So we have this economic interest as being the main driver for creation of some strategies, and then Germany tries also to incorporate all those ideological and order shaping factors as well.
The second question: is there any distinctive element that Germany is using to navigate through the multipolar world, especially when those emerging powers have different regimes, maybe geopolitical interests, or even economies?
This becomes more and more complicated now, taking into account Russia's aggression against Ukraine, China's role and the positioning of all the broad group of global South states and emerging powers, however we call them, we can see that it's really the situation has changed. So these states are now in a let's call it higher ground or better negotiating position. They can they don't have to wait with open arms to any offer from the West or from Germany for a cooperation. They can now more choose more according to their interest and to balance between several groups of states. So the best example would be India or Brazil, right? In one format with BRICS together with Russia and China, and on the other hand, really engaging into relations with EU and Germany. So this makes it difficult for Germany to follow this Wertepartnerschaften, so these partnerships based on values, and to follow this path. And I would say that this is the challenge for German policy right now, that it needs again to adapt. So this trend of adaptation is still very important, and adapt again into more realistic, maybe more selective partnerships. I think this is already happening because Germany needs to diversify, for example, its policy in Asia to de-risk from China, and here it needs India, it needs Indonesia, it needs ASEAN states. And when they don't really follow the Western perspective on be it Russian aggression and relations with Russia, and actually, in the case of India, still cooperate, or in the case of Brazil, then it is not a very. It should not be a decisive condition for Germany to involve into cooperation. Of course, it's difficult because then you get this criticism and questions about why and on which conditions is one state a strategic partner and the other is not. Like you mentioned, different regimes. We didn't talk a lot about China, but I think this case is really clear with Chinese policy being not really in line with democratic and human rights standards of the West. So I would say realist perspective is coming back also in Germany's global policy, and more selective way of developing those partnerships. But the main driver or the main justification has not changed. So we could wrap it up with what Chancellor Scholz describes as the main orientation for Germany and how it should react to what's happening. He kind of neglects the idea of deglobalization. He says that the world is getting more and more multipolar, that there are new centers of power, and that we as the West, as Germany, should not treat the rise of new powers, new actors as a threat or as maybe as a challenge, but we should embrace it and kind of engage in cooperation on our own terms and kind of try to benefit the best we can from each partnership. So I think this is visible, and I would also assume this would be like this with the new German government, most probably under new Chancellor Friedrich Merz, but this is another discussion. So I think there are some constant points definitely which remain unchanged, with some adaptation still needed.
Thomas, many thanks. I think sharing what you research in terms and regarding Germany is very important, because the multipolar world, the geopolitical shifts, and everything that we experience at the moment, together in combination with the war in Ukraine and conflict in the Middle East, emerging powers, I think, are going to be in the center of our interests, of our political interest. So again, thank you very much for your insightful thoughts, for sharing your research. I wish you good luck with your research, with your publications, and thank you for being on IR Thinker.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and I hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.